I wish I had trusted my instincts sooner. There are moments in life when everything shifts, when the air changes, when your heart recognizes danger before your mind can catch up. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in the front seat of my car with my 5-year-old son trembling beside me. His small hand gripped my arm so tightly I could feel his fingernails digging through my sleeve. And then he whispered the words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. "Mom, don't take me back there." His voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the hum of the engine. But the fear in his eyes, wide, glassy, desperate, was impossible to miss. My breath caught in my throat. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I wanted to pull over right then, to hold him, to demand answers. But something in his expression stopped me. He looked like a child who had just escaped something unspeakable and was terrified it might pull him back in. Before that day, I truly believed we were a normal family. My husband, Daniel, and I had been married for 7 years. We weren't perfect, but we were happy. And his parents, especially his mother, Linda, had always been a steady presence in our lives. She'd been there when our son, Ethan, was born. She'd watched him every week so I could work. She'd baked his favorite cookies, read him bedtime stories, called him her little angel. I trusted her completely. Maybe that was my mistake. That morning, I dropped Ethan off at their house like I had dozens of times before. Linda had greeted me at the door with her usual warm smile, pulling Ethan into a hug as she waved me off. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she'd said. "We'll take good care of him." And I'd believed her. I'd driven away without a second thought, grateful for the help, grateful for family. But now, sitting in the car with my son's terrified whisper still echoing in my ears, I replayed that moment over and over. Had I missed something? Had there been a sign, a flicker of hesitation in Ethan's eyes, a stiffness in Linda's smile that I'd been too distracted to notice? I glanced at Ethan in the rearview mirror. He was staring out the window, his small body rigid, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. He wasn't crying. He wasn't screaming. He was just silent. And that silence terrified me more than anything he could have said. "Ethan," I said softly, my voice barely steady, "what happened today, baby?" He didn't answer. He just shook his head, his lips pressed into a tight line, and turned his face away from me. I wanted to push him for answers. I wanted to turn the car around and storm back into that house and demand to know what had gone wrong. But something told me to wait. Something told me that whatever had happened, it was too fragile, too frightening for him to talk about yet. So I drove home in silence, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to ask. And all I could think was, if I had known what happened in that house today, I would have never left him there. The moment I walked through the door to pick up Ethan that afternoon, I should have known something was wrong. Linda was standing in the hallway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face lit up with that practiced, cheerful expression she always wore. "There you are," she'd said brightly. "Ethan's been such a good boy today, haven't you, sweetheart?" Ethan had been sitting on the couch, completely still, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He didn't jump up to greet me the way he usually did. He didn't run over and wrap his arms around my legs, chattering excitedly about his day. He just sat there, staring at the floor, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself invisible. At the time, I'd chalked it up to tiredness. Maybe they'd played outside for too long. Maybe he'd skipped his nap. Kids got moody sometimes. It was normal, wasn't it? But now, as I sat on the edge of Ethan's bed that night, watching him curl into a tight ball under his blankets, I couldn't stop replaying that scene.
The way Linda's smile hadn't quite reached her eyes, the way she'd spoken a little too quickly, a little too brightly, like she was filling the silence with noise. The way Ethan had flinched, just slightly, when she'd placed a hand on his shoulder. I'd ignored it all. I had smiled back, thanked her for watching him, and ushered Ethan out the door without asking a single question. God, I hated myself for that. "Ethan," I whispered, brushing a strand of hair off his forehead. "Can you tell me what's bothering you? Did something happen at Grandma and Grandpa's house?" He squeezed his eyes shut and shook his head. "I don't want to talk about it." "Baby, you can tell me anything. You know that, right? No matter what it is, I'll listen. I'll believe you." For a moment, I thought he might open up. His bottom lip trembled, and his hands gripped the edge of his blanket so tightly his knuckles went white. But then he turned away from me, burying his face in the pillow. "Please, Mom, just don't make me go back there. Please." My chest tightened. I wanted to press him for answers, but I could see how fragile he was in that moment, like one wrong word might shatter him completely. So I stayed silent, rubbing small circles on his back until his breathing slowed and he finally drifted off to sleep. But I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in the dark, staring up a ceiling, my mind spinning with possibilities I didn't want to believe. What could have happened in that house to make my brave, fearless little boy so terrified?
When Daniel came to bed, I told him what Ethan had said. I expected concern, maybe even alarm. But instead, he sighed and rubbed his eyes, clearly exhausted. "He's probably just overtired," Daniel said, his voice heavy with dismissiveness. "You know how kids are. They get overwhelmed and blow things out of proportion." "Daniel, he's terrified," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "He literally begged me not to take him back there. That's not normal." "My mother would never hurt him," Daniel said firmly, turning to look at me. "You know that. She loves Ethan more than anything." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this was all just a misunderstanding, that Ethan had had a bad day and would be fine by morning. But the look in my son's eyes when he'd whispered those words in the car, that wasn't exhaustion. That was fear. "Maybe we should skip next week's visit," I suggested carefully, just to give him some space. Daniel frowned. "That would hurt my mom's feelings. She'd think we don't trust her." "Maybe we shouldn't," I said quietly. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned away, pulling the blanket over his shoulder. "You're overreacting. He'll be fine." But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the sound of Daniel's breathing slow into sleep, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't overreacting. Something had happened in that house, and whether my husband believed me or not, I was going to find out what it was. The scream tore through the house at 2:47 a.m. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest, and stumbled out of bed before my brain had fully caught up with my body. Daniel groaned and rolled over, half asleep, as I sprinted down the hallway toward Ethan's room. When I pushed open the door, I found him sitting up in bed, his face pale and streaked with tears, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. His eyes were open, but he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at something in the corner of the room, something only he could see. "Ethan," I whispered, rushing to his side and pulling him into my arms. "It's okay, baby. It's just a dream. You're safe. I'm here." He clung to me like I was the only thing keeping him from drowning, his small body shaking violently. "I don't want to go back," he sobbed into my shoulder. "Please, Mom, don't make me go back." My throat tightened. "Back where, sweetheart? To Grandma's house?" He nodded frantically, his tears soaking through my shirt. "I don't want to. I don't want to." I held him tighter, rocking him gently as I tried to calm the storm of panic rising in my own chest. This wasn't just a bad dream. This was trauma. This was fear so deep it had followed him into sleep and refused to let go. You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to, I promise. No one is going to make you do anything you're not comfortable with, okay? He didn't respond, just kept crying, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. I stayed with him until his sobs quieted, until his breathing evened out, until he finally fell back asleep in my arms. Even then, I didn't leave. I sat on the edge of his bed, watching him, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to answer. This was the third nightmare in as many nights. Each time it was the same, the screaming, the crying, the desperate pleas not to go back. And each time I felt more helpless, more furious, more certain that something terrible had happened in that house.
The next morning, I tried again. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, pushing cereal around his bowl without eating. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and he looked smaller somehow, like he'd folded in on himself. I sat down across from him, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee I hadn't touched. "Ethan," I said gently, "I need you to talk to me. What happened at Grandma and Grandpa's house?" He froze, his spoon hovering over the bowl. For a moment, I thought he might finally tell me, but then he set the spoon down and shook his head. "I can't." "Why not, baby?" "Because," his voice cracked and his eyes filled with tears, "because Grandpa said I'd get in trouble if I told." The air left my lungs. My hands tightened around the mug until I was sure it would shatter. "What did Grandpa do?" I asked, my voice trembling with barely controlled rage. Ethan didn't answer. He just stared at his cereal, tears streaming silently down his cheeks. When Daniel came downstairs a few minutes later, I pulled him aside and told him what Ethan had said. This time, I didn't soften my words. I didn't try to be gentle. "Daniel, your father did something to him, and whatever it was bad enough that Ethan is having nightmares every single night." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's a serious accusation." "I know," I said, my voice shaking, "but look at our son. Look at him, Daniel. Does he look like a kid who's just overtired?" Daniel glanced toward the kitchen where Ethan sat slumped at the table, staring blankly at nothing. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker across my husband's face. "I'll talk to my parents," he said finally, "but I'm sure there's an explanation." "There better be," I said coldly, "because if there's not, I'm never letting him near them again."
2 days later, I made a decision. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't ask for permission. I just got in the car while Ethan was at school and drove to my in-laws' house. I told myself I was going to have a calm, rational conversation. I told myself I would give them a chance to explain. But the truth was, I was done being polite. I was done pretending everything was fine. My son was falling apart, and I needed answers. When I pulled into their driveway, Linda's car was parked out front. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding, and waited. Linda answered with a startled expression. "Oh, I wasn't expecting you," she said, her smile strained. "Is everything okay?" "Can I come in?" I asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Of course." She stepped aside, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted nervously toward the stairs. I walked into the living room, my gaze sweeping over the familiar space. Everything looked normal. The framed family photos on the mantel, the crocheted blanket draped over the couch, the faint smell of vanilla candles. But something felt wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. "Where's your husband?" I asked. "He's out running errands," said Linda quickly. "What's this about?" I turned to face her, crossing my arms. "Ethan has been having nightmares. Every night since he was here last week. He's terrified of coming back here." Linda's face paled. I don't understand. He was fine when he left." "No, he wasn't." I said, my voice hard. He begged me not to bring him back here. He said your husband told him he'd get in trouble if he talked about what happened. That's ridiculous, Linda said, but her voice wavered. My husband would never... Then explain why my son is waking up screaming in the middle of the night. Explain why he won't eat, why he won't talk, why he looks like he's seen something he can't unsee. That morning, I dropped Ethan off at their house like I had dozens of times before. Linda had greeted me at the door with her usual warm smile, pulling Ethan into a hug as she waved me off. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she'd said. "We'll take good care of him." And I'd believed her. I'd driven away without a second thought, grateful for the help, grateful for family. But now, sitting in the car with my son's terrified whisper still echoing in my ears, I replayed that moment over and over. Had I missed something? Had there been a sign, a flicker of hesitation in Ethan's eyes, a stiffness in Linda's smile that I'd been too distracted to notice? I glanced at Ethan in the rearview mirror. He was staring out the window, his small body rigid, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. He wasn't crying. He wasn't screaming. He was just silent. And that silence terrified me more than anything he could have said. "Ethan," I said softly, my voice barely steady, "what happened today, baby?" He didn't answer. He just shook his head, his lips pressed into a tight line, and turned his face away from me. I wanted to push him for answers. I wanted to turn the car around and storm back into that house and demand to know what had gone wrong. But something told me to wait. Something told me that whatever had happened, it was too fragile, too frightening for him to talk about yet. So I drove home in silence, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to ask. And all I could think was, if I had known what happened in that house today, I would have never left him there. That evening, I sat Ethan down in his room, just the two of us. Daniel was still at work, and part of me was glad, because I needed Ethan to feel safe, to know that no one would dismiss him, no one would tell him he was wrong. "Ethan," I said gently, kneeling in front of him, "I went to Grandma's house today, and I saw something that made me think, maybe something bad happened there, something you didn't feel like you could tell me about." He looked up at me, his eyes wide and filled with fear. "Are you mad at me?" "Mad at you?" I reached out and took his small hands in mine. "Baby, no, I could never be mad at you. I just need you to tell me the truth, okay? No matter what it is." His bottom lip trembled. "But Grandpa said..." "I don't care what Grandpa said," I interrupted, my voice firm but gentle. "Whatever he told you, it wasn't true. You're not going to get in trouble for telling me. I promise." For a long moment, he just stared at me, like he was trying to decide if he could trust me. Then, slowly, the words began to spill out. "We were playing in the living room, and I knocked over his juice. It was an accident. I didn't mean to." I nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Grandpa got really angry," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. "He yelled at me. He said I was clumsy and stupid. And then he grabbed my arm really hard and pulled me downstairs." My heart clenched. "What happened downstairs, Ethan?" "He locked me in the dark, in the little room under the stairs. He said I needed to learn to be more careful. I tried to open the door, but I couldn't. I kept calling for Grandma, but she didn't come. I was in there for a really long time, Mom. I was so scared." I pulled him into my arms, my own tears falling freely now. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." "When Grandpa finally let me out," Ethan continued, his voice muffled against my shoulder, "he said if I told anyone, he'd put me back in there, and it would be even worse next time." Rage, white hot and consuming, flooded through me.
I held Ethan tighter, trying to steady my shaking hands, trying to keep my voice calm for his sake. You did the right thing by telling me, and I promise you, you're never going back there. Ever. When Daniel came home an hour later, I told him everything. I told him about the basement, about the rope, about what Ethan had finally confessed. I watched the color drain from his face, watched his hands curl into fists, watched the disbelief give way to horror. "My father did that?" he said, his voice hollow. "He locked our son in the dark?" "Yes," I said quietly. "And your mother knew. She didn't stop him." Daniel sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. I don't understand. How could they? It doesn't matter how," I said, my voice hard. "What matters is that it happened, and now we have to decide what we're going to do about it." For a long time, Daniel didn't say anything. He just sat there, his shoulders shaking, and I realized he was crying. It was the first time I'd ever seen him cry. "We're never letting him near them again," he said, finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Never." I nodded. "Good, because if you'd said anything else, I would have left with Ethan tonight."
The next day, Daniel and I drove to his parents' house together. This time, we didn't call ahead. We didn't ask for permission. We just showed up. When Linda opened the door, her face went pale. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling, "what are you doing here?" "Where's Dad?" Daniel asked, his voice cold. "He's in the living room." But Daniel pushed past her without another word. I followed close behind, my heart pounding. His father, Robert, was sitting in his recliner, reading the newspaper. He looked up when we entered, his expression unreadable. "Daniel," he said calmly, "what's this about?" "You know exactly what this is about," Daniel said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "What you did to my son." Robert set down the newspaper, his face hardening. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Daniel snapped. "Ethan told us everything. You locked him in the basement. You scared him so badly he's been having nightmares every night. How could you do that to him? He's 5 years old." Robert stood up, his jaw tight. The boy needed discipline. He was reckless, careless. Someone had to teach him a lesson. "A lesson?" I said, my voice rising. "You traumatized him." "He'll get over it," Robert said dismissively. "Kids are resilient." Daniel stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You're sick. You're absolutely sick. And you're never going near my son again." "He's my grandson," Robert said, his voice rising. "You can't keep him from me." "Watch me." Linda, who had been standing in the doorway, finally spoke. "Daniel, please," she said, her voice breaking. "He didn't mean—" "Don't," I interrupted, turning to face her. "Don't you dare defend him. You knew what he did. You stood by and let it happen. You're just as guilty as he is." "I didn't know he'd lock him in the basement," Linda said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought he was just talking to him. I didn't realize." "You heard Ethan crying," I said, my voice hard. "You heard him screaming for help, and you did nothing." Linda crumbled, sinking onto the couch. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry." But her apology meant nothing. The damage was already done. Daniel turned back to his father. "We're done here," he said. "And if you ever try to contact us, if you ever try to see Ethan again, I'll make sure everyone knows what you did. I'll make sure you never get near another child." Robert's face turned red. "You're overreacting. This is ridiculous." "No," Daniel said, his voice steady. "What's ridiculous is that I ever trusted you." And with that, he turned and walked out. I followed, leaving Linda sobbing on the couch and Robert standing in stunned silence. As we drove away, Daniel reached over and took my hand. "I'm sorry," he said quietly,
for not believing you sooner. I squeezed his hand. You believe me now. That's what matters.
It's been 3 months since we cut ties with Daniel's parents. At first, Ethan didn't understand. He kept asking why we weren't visiting Grandma anymore, why she didn't call, why things had changed. We explained it as gently as we could, that Grandpa had made choices that hurt him, and that sometimes keeping someone safe means keeping them away from people who aren't safe, even if they're family. It was hard. God, it was so hard. But slowly, day by day, I watched my son begin to heal. The nightmares stopped, his appetite came back. He started smiling again. Real smiles, not the hollow, forced ones he'd been wearing like a mask. And one day, when I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me and said, "I'm glad I told you, Mom." I blinked back tears. "Me too, baby." We started therapy, both for Ethan and for Daniel and me. A kind, patient woman with a warm office and soft voice who helped Ethan process what had happened, who taught him that what his grandfather did wasn't his fault, that he didn't deserve to be punished for a simple mistake. And slowly, Ethan began to understand that he was safe now, that no one was going to hurt him, that his voice mattered. Daniel struggled with it in his own way. He carried guilt like a weight on his shoulders. Guilt for not believing me sooner, guilt for not protecting Ethan, guilt for the parents he thought he knew turning out to be something else entirely. But he showed up. He went to therapy. He held Ethan when the fear crept back in, and he rebuilt the trust he'd almost lost. As for me, I'll be honest, I still struggle with forgiveness. Some days I think about Linda's tears, about the brokenness in her voice when she apologized, and I wonder if there's a version of this story where we could have found our way back to each other. But then I think about Ethan, trembling in the car, whispering those words that changed everything. And I remember that forgiveness isn't about letting people off the hook. It's not about pretending the harm didn't happen. It's about choosing peace over bitterness, even when the wound still aches. We haven't heard from Daniel's parents since that day. Linda tried calling once, a few weeks after the confrontation. Daniel let it go to voicemail. He listened to it later, her voice shaking, asking for a chance to make things right. But some things can't be fixed with apologies. Some things require distance, boundaries, and time. And maybe one day there will be space for reconciliation. But that day isn't today. Today, our priority is Ethan, his healing, his safety, his voice. A few nights ago, Ethan crawled into bed with me. He curled up against my side, his head on my shoulder, and sighed contentedly. "Mom?" "Yeah, baby." "I'm not scared anymore." I kissed the top of his head, my heart full. "Good. You never have to be scared again." If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's this. Never ignore the small tremble in your child's voice. Never dismiss the fear in their eyes, the hesitation in their words, the silence that speaks louder than anything they could say. Because sometimes love isn't about keeping the peace. It's not about protecting relationships or preserving the image of a happy family. Sometimes love means choosing distance. It means setting boundaries, even when it hurts. It means believing your child, even when everyone else tells you you're wrong. And sometimes forgiveness isn't about them. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of anger, the prison of bitterness. It's about choosing to move forward, not because they deserve it, but because you do. Ethan is safe now. He's healing. And that's all that matters. The truth is never too small to matter, and a child's whisper is never too quiet to be heard.